He left it all to me. Oh, my dear, gone too soon. He left us everything. Everything.
Hey guys, tonight we delve into a profession so steeped in sorrow, so entwined with the deepest human grief, that it almost feels like a product of fiction. But trust me, this was very real. Imagine a bustling ancient city, the air thick with the scent of spices and sweat, the murmur of 1,000 lives unfolding around you. Then, a sudden piercing wail cuts through the din, followed by another and another. You turn to see a procession, somber and slow, making its way through the narrow streets. At its head, not just family, but a group of figures, faces contorted in anguish, tears streaming, their cries echoing off the stone buildings, professional mourners, lamenting a loss that isn't their own. You probably wouldn't survive this line of work, not with your emotional circuits intact, let alone the social stigma of openly weeping on command. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Comment your city and local time. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported, not through a simple time machine, but through the collective memory of human sorrow. Your first stop is ancient Egypt, a land obsessed with the afterlife. Here, death was not an end, but a transition. And every transition required proper ritual. You see women, often known as the kites of Horus, their hair disheveled, their clothes rent, their bodies smeared with mud or ashes. They beat their chests, letting out high-pitched wails that are both mournful and rhythmic, guiding the deceased soul, so they believed, to the duat, the underworld. These aren't just heartbroken relatives. These are performers, hired to amplify the grief, to ensure the departed received a send-off befitting their status. A common practice involved these women smearing themselves with clay or dust as a visible sign of distress, a ritualistic mirroring of the earth returning to earth. Travel west now, across the Mediterranean, and you stand amidst the grandeur of ancient Rome. Funerals here were elaborate affairs, often public spectacles designed to showcase the deceased's importance and the family's wealth. You observe a funeral procession winding through the forum. Leading the way are musicians, then actors wearing masks of the ancestors, then slaves, and finally the professional mourners, the praefici. These are not slaves, but often free women, sometimes even those with a certain poetic flair. Their role is to lament, to sing dirges, and to eloquently praise the virtues of the dead. Their cries are not just spontaneous outbursts. They are structured, almost theatrical performances, carefully calibrated to evoke maximum pathos from the onlookers. One particularly odd detail is the tear vial, or lacrimatorium. While not exclusively used by professional mourners, it was certainly a custom for some to collect their tears in small glass or clay bottles to be buried with the deceased, symbolizing the depth of grief. The more tears collected, the greater the lament, the more esteemed the deceased. It was a tangible, if unusual, measure of sorrow. You watch as one praefice subtly wipes her eyes, perhaps a little too artfully, and then, with a flourish, tips her hand to show a small, clear vial already catching a few glistening drops. The lines between genuine sorrow and performed anguish blur easily in this ancient world, where public image often overshadowed private feeling. The sheer theatricality of it all is striking. Grief in these times was not just felt, it was staged. Your journey continues, forward in time, and you find yourself amidst the shifting religious and social landscapes of medieval Europe. The grand public displays of grief you witnessed in Rome have somewhat receded, replaced by a more internalized, Christian-influenced view of death. Yet, the need for communal expression of sorrow persists, albeit in altered forms. You walk through a muddy village street, the air damp and cool. A death bell tolls, a slow, mournful sound that signals a departure. Here, the professional mourner, if they exist at all in a dedicated capacity, is often intertwined with the church's role in last rites. Monks and priests lead prayers, and sometimes the community itself provides the collective lament. However, an interesting, albeit less formal, practice emerges: the wailing woman at the wake. These aren't hired professionals in the Roman sense, but often older women within the community, sometimes seen as possessing a particular knack for expressing grief, whose cries might prompt others to weep, facilitating the communal grieving process. The church, however, often viewed excessive demonstrative wailing with suspicion, associating it with pagan practices or a lack of Christian resignation to God's will. They preferred solemn prayers and quiet contemplation over public hysterics. This tension between ingrained social custom and religious doctrine creates a fascinating dynamic. One peculiar aspect you notice is the rise of mourning rituals involving specific attire. While not always requiring professional mourners, the focus shifts to the appearance of grief. You see families, even entire villages, clad in dark, simple clothing, sometimes even sackcloth and ashes, as a public declaration of their loss. This visual conformity becomes a silent, collective lament, replacing the boisterous displays of antiquity. The color black, a somber and unambiguous statement, starts to gain prominence as the universal symbol of mourning during this period. It's a less performative grief, perhaps, but a more pervasive one, etched into the very fabric of society. As you move through this era, you witness funeral processions that are less about theatrics and more about communal solidarity and religious observance. The deceased is often carried to the graveyard by neighbors or guild members, accompanied by priests chanting Latin verses. While the dedicated prefici are largely absent, the town crier sometimes takes on a tangential, mournful duty. You hear a man not formally hired to weep, but whose job it is to publicly announce deaths, often with a mournful cadence in his voice, his cries echoing through the narrow, cobbled streets. Hear ye, hear ye. By the grace of God, Eleanor, wife of Thomas the baker, has passed to her eternal rest. While not shedding tears on cue, his very presence and pronouncements serve to disseminate the news of death, and in doing so, invite communal remembrance and inevitably sorrow. His voice, though not overtly weeping, still carries the weight of the somber tidings, a public acknowledgement of loss that prompts others to mourn. The individual sorrow is folded into the collective, community grief, where everyone plays a part, however small, in acknowledging the departure of a soul. Your temporal journey now guides you eastward, to the rich and diverse funeral traditions of Asia. You find yourself in various historical settings, from ancient Chinese courts to bustling Japanese towns and vibrant Indian communities, where the expression of grief, while deeply personal, often becomes a public and highly ritualized affair. Unlike the more subdued European customs you just left, here, professional mourners often hold a more prominent and sometimes even revered position. In imperial China, for instance, mourning rituals were incredibly complex and dictated by social status and Confucian principles of filial piety. You witness elaborate funeral processions, where the deceased's social standing is reflected in the number of mourners. You see men and women, often wearing coarse white or undyed garments, hired specifically to wail and lament. Their cries are not just random outbursts. They follow a certain rhythm, a kind of mournful chanting that can rise to a crescendo of heart-wrenching screams. These criers or weepers were essential for demonstrating the family's devotion and ensuring a proper burial. A well-known custom was the practice of mourning houses where families would hire professionals to maintain a continuous display of grief for a set period, sometimes for weeks or even months after the death. This was not just for show. It was believed to honor the ancestors and ensure peace for the departed soul. Moving to Japan, particularly during the Edo period, you observe a more nuanced approach. While less outwardly theatrical than their Chinese counterparts, professional mourners, known as naki-onna or weeping women, were sometimes employed, particularly for high-ranking families. Their role was often to lead the wailing, to set the tone for the family's grief, and to ensure the proper rituals of lamentation were observed. A subtle yet fascinating detail often associated with Japanese funerary practices, though not always directly linked to professional mourners, is the practice of burning incense. As mourners, professional or otherwise, would approach the altar, they would light incense sticks, the smoke rising symbolically towards the heavens, a quiet offering of remembrance and sorrow, in stark contrast to the loud wails. Further south, in parts of India, especially within certain communities, the tradition of professional mourners, known as rudali, from the Sanskrit word rud, meaning to cry, persists even into more recent history. You see women, often from lower castes, dressed in dark, simple clothing, hired to weep loudly and dramatically at funerals. Their performances are intense, involving rhythmic chest beating, tearing of hair, and soul-stirring lamentations that can last for hours. These women often live on the fringes of society, their lives interwoven with death and sorrow, yet they provide an essential service, allowing families to grieve privately while the rudali publicly express the collective sorrow. An particularly distinctive aspect of the rudali's practice is their improvisational poetry. They would not just cry, but often compose and recite mournful verses on the spot, eulogizing the deceased and expressing the pain of loss through a powerful, poetic lament that often moved onlookers to tears. Their art was not just about sound, but about evocative words that painted vivid pictures of the life that had ended. The depth and raw emotion they could evoke were truly remarkable. You are now propelled into the heart of the Victorian era, a time of immense social change, rigid etiquette, and a morbid fascination with death. As you step into a grand, somber London townhouse, you immediately sense a shift. Grief here is not just an emotion. It is a highly structured, almost performative art form, and professional mourners become an integral part of this elaborate theater of sorrow. The death of Queen Victoria's beloved Albert plunged the nation into decades of intense mourning, setting a precedent for a vast and intricate set of mourning customs that permeated all levels of society. You observe a funeral procession, far more refined than the ancient spectacles, yet equally imbued with a sense of importance. The hearse is drawn by black horses, their plumes swaying rhythmically, followed by a line of carriages. And there, walking ahead, or sometimes directly behind the coffin, are the mutes and undertaker's men. These are the professional mourners of the Victorian age. The mutes, often tall men dressed in somber black cloaks, top hats with long hatbands, and carrying staves draped in black crepe, stand silently at the entrance of the house or walk solemnly in the procession. Their role is not to weep or wail, but to embody silent, dignified sorrow. They are living symbols of grief, their very stillness and solemnity conveying the gravitas of the occasion. It's a stark contrast to the dramatic lamentations of earlier eras. Here, grief is expressed through reserved decorum and outward display of respect. A particularly curious aspect of this period is the hyper-commercialization of mourning. Undertakers, or funeral directors as they began to be called, offered comprehensive packages that included not just the coffin and burial plot, but also the mutes, mourning coaches, specific mourning attire for the family, and even black draperies for the house. You see advertisements in newspapers for mourning warehouse, offering everything from bonnets to mourning stationery. Grief had become a booming industry. A truly odd yet common detail was the use of weepers' cloaks, or mourning cloaks, for the mutes, sometimes incredibly elaborate. Made of heavy black wool and designed to make the wearer appear even more imposing and sorrowful. The longer the crepe streamers on a mute's hat, the higher the status of the deceased, a subtle visual signal of importance in this era of strict social stratification. You also notice the meticulous rules surrounding mourning dress. Widows, in particular, were expected to wear full mourning for a year and a day, entirely black, dull fabrics, with no jewelry except perhaps jet. This would then gradually lighten over time to half mourning, with grays, purples, or lavenders. While not directly involving professional mourners, this strict adherence to sartorial codes demonstrates the pervasive nature of performed grief. The mutes, with their standardized, imposing presence, were the ultimate embodiment of this rigid performance. Silent witnesses to sorrow, their very existence a testament to the Victorian need for order, even in the face of death. Their job was not to feel the grief, but to project its outward, acceptable form. Your journey now takes a cultural detour, landing you on the verdant, mist-shrouded shores of Ireland, where a unique and profoundly moving form of professional mourning flourished, the tradition of the Irish keeners. This practice, known as caoinead, pronounced queen meaning to weep or to lament, was not about silent dignity or commercial display, but raw, unrestrained, and often beautiful vocalization of grief. You find yourself at a rural Irish wake in the 18th or 19th century, a gathering that, despite the sorrow, is also a vital communal event. The air is thick with the scent of whiskey and peat smoke, punctuated by murmurs and hushed conversations. Then, a sound begins, low and mournful, building in intensity. These are the keeners, almost always women, whose voices are their instruments of sorrow. They are not merely crying, they are performing a complex, improvised lament, a form of vocal poetry that is both deeply personal and universally resonant. The caoinead is characterized by its high-pitched, ululating cries, melodic wails, and often improvised verses that eulogize the deceased, recounting their virtues, their life story, and the deep loss felt by the community. It's a spontaneous outpouring, yet it follows certain traditional structures, passed down through generations. The keeners were not simply hired hands. They were often revered figures, women with an extraordinary ability to channel and express collective grief. Their skill lay in their capacity to articulate the unspoken sorrow, to give voice to the community's anguish. It was believed that a good keen could help the soul of the departed find peace, and could also serve to initiate the grieving process for the living. A truly unique aspect of the keen was its unpredictability and improvisational nature. While there were common melodic phrases, each keen was unique, adapting to the individual's life and the specific circumstances of their death. The keeners would often walk around the coffin, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of their lament, sometimes even pulling at their hair or tearing at their clothes in a symbolic display of distress. One particularly poignant detail about the keeners is their connection to ancient Celtic traditions. The practice is thought to have roots stretching back centuries, long before Christianity arrived in Ireland. It speaks to a deep, primal need to vocally express sorrow and to honor the dead through sound. The sound of the keen was so distinctive and powerful that it was often seen as the very sound of Irish grief. Despite their cultural significance, the keeners were often viewed with a degree of suspicion by the Catholic Church, which preferred more solemn, controlled expressions of grief and prayer. They saw the keen as a pagan relic, too wild and emotional for proper Christian funerals. Yet, the tradition persisted in many rural areas, a testament to its profound hold on the Irish psyche, an enduring wail echoing through the landscape, guiding the dead and consoling the living. As you continue your journey through the shadowy world of professional mourning, you stumble into a realm where grief intertwines with ancient fears and superstitions. You are in a time when the line between the living and the dead felt thinner, when every strange occurrence could be attributed to malevolent spirits or lingering souls. Professional mourners, by the very nature of their work, stood at this precarious threshold, leading to a host of folkloric beliefs and fears surrounding them. You observe a funeral in a dimly lit, rural setting, perhaps a Germanic village in the late Middle Ages, or an isolated community in Eastern Europe. The air is heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. As the mourners, some genuinely grieving, some hired, begin their lamentations, you notice whispers among the onlookers. Because these individuals handled the dead, touched the coffin, and often spent prolonged periods in the presence of corpses, they were often viewed with a peculiar mix of respect and apprehension. People believed they might carry a taint of death, a spiritual residue from their proximity to the departed. This wasn't necessarily a curse, but a liminal quality that set them apart. One widespread belief, particularly unsettling, revolved around the idea that unappeased spirits might linger around the body, and by extension, around those who mourned them most intensely. It was thought that if a mourner, professional or otherwise, did not perform their duties with sufficient sincerity, or if their grief was feigned too obviously, the deceased's spirit might become restless or even malevolent. This put immense pressure on professional mourners to deliver convincing performances, not just for the living, but for the unseen dead. A particularly eerie detail is the folk belief that too much wailing could actually call back the spirit of the dead, or attract other restless spirits to the household. While mourners were hired to lament, there was often an unspoken line that shouldn't be crossed, a balance between honoring the dead and not inviting unwanted supernatural attention. This created a strange paradox. Mourn loudly enough to show respect, but not so loudly as to disturb the veil between worlds. You also encounter the notion of corpse dust, or grave dirt, as having mystical properties. While not always directly linked to mourners, their frequent presence at burials meant they were often seen as having access to such substances, which were sometimes used in folk magic for both protection and harm. This further added to their mystique and isolation within communities. Furthermore, in some traditions, it was believed that professional mourners, being so close to death, might develop a kind of second sight, or an ability to perceive spirits, making them objects of both fear and curious fascination. Their intimate connection to the moment of transition lent them an aura of the otherworldly. The very act of feigning sorrow, of putting on a mask of grief, could also be seen as inviting darker entities, as if one was opening a portal through performance. The professional mourner, then, wasn't just a person, but a figure shrouded in whispers, a living bridge to the unknown. You now shift your perspective to peer behind the veil of tears, to understand the raw mechanics of the professional mourner's craft. This isn't just about showing up and crying. It's about a nuanced performance, an art of emotional manipulation, both of oneself and of the audience. You are observing a training session, perhaps in a quiet corner of ancient Rome, or listening to the seasoned advice of an Irish keener to a younger apprentice. The first lesson you learn is about the control of the body and voice. For the Roman prefecti, this meant learning specific vocalizations, how to produce a wail that sounded genuinely heartbroken, but could also be sustained for long periods without damaging the voice. They practiced specific gestures, tearing at hair or appearing to, beating the chest and falling to their knees. It was a physical language of despair, meticulously rehearsed. An important aspect of their technique was the use of crocodile tears, literally finding ways to induce tears on command. This could involve rubbing irritants like onions under the eyes, or even subtle pinching to bring a flush to the face and moisture to the eyes. It wasn't about feeling the grief, but about producing its outward signs convincingly. In contrast, the Irish keeners relied less on physical irritants and more on emotional recall and vocal artistry. You hear an older keener explaining how to tap into universal themes of loss and sorrow, even if the deceased was a stranger. They would draw upon their own past griefs, or even imagine scenarios of loss, to evoke genuine emotion that would then be channeled into their improvised laments. The power of their performance lay in their ability to convey a sense of genuine, raw heartbreak through their ululations and poetic verses. Their technique often involved a specific breathing control that allowed them to sustain long, high-pitched wails without losing breath or cracking their voice. It was a physically demanding art, requiring incredible lung capacity and vocal resilience. Beyond the tears and wails, there's the art of the eulogy. Especially in cultures where mourners recited praises for the dead, there was a skill in quickly gathering information about the deceased from the family and weaving it into a compelling, often flattering, narrative. This wasn't just about sadness, it was about elevating the departed, ensuring their memory was honored. One particularly fascinating technique employed by some professional mourners was the sympathy reading. They would subtly read the emotional state of the primary grievers and adjust their performance to match, amplifying or softening their lamentations to resonate with the family's level of distress. If the family was stoic, the mourners might be subtly more reserved. If they were openly weeping, the professionals would rise to meet that intensity. It was a sophisticated form of emotional mirroring, designed to validate and facilitate the family's own grieving process, making their purchased grief feel authentic and necessary. The professional mourner wasn't just crying for you, they were crying with you, creating a shared emotional space. As you observe the intricate performances of these hired griefsmiths, a perplexing question arises. What was their social status? Were they revered for their unique skill, or reviled for profiting from sorrow? The answer, you discover, is a complex tapestry woven with threads of essential service, suspicion, and sometimes outright disdain. Their position in society was often paradoxical. perched precariously between necessity and ignominy. In ancient societies like Rome, the praeficae held a somewhat ambiguous standing. While their presence was crucial for a proper, dignified funeral, they weren't necessarily considered part of the elite. They were often free women, sometimes even respected for their oratorical skills, yet their association with death and public emotional display could set them apart. It was a professional service, much like any other, but one tinged with the discomfort many feel around the raw display of grief. A key detail that highlights their mixed status is that while they were paid for their services, they were generally not invited to the private, more intimate parts of the mourning rituals, often being dismissed once the public procession was over. They were essential performers, but largely external to the family's core grief. Fast forward to medieval and early modern Europe, where the professional mourner, if not a formal institution, often blurred with the village's marginalized figures. The old woman who was particularly good at wailing, or the town crier who added a mournful cadence to his announcements, might be paid in kind or coin, but they often remained on the fringes. Their skill was recognized, but their constant proximity to death and their sometimes uninhibited emotional displays could make them seem slightly other, perhaps even a little wild or unholy to the more rigid sensibilities of the time. There was a subtle unease that someone could turn on grief for money, hinting at a lack of true feeling, even if their service was deemed necessary. Perhaps the most stark example of this liminal social position is found with the Irish keeners and the Indian rudali. While deeply integrated into the cultural fabric of their communities, and often highly valued for their ability to articulate profound sorrow, they often came from the lower rungs of society. The rudali, in particular, were, and sometimes still are, often women from marginalized castes, whose economic circumstances forced them into a profession that others shunned. Their essential role in funeral rites often contrasted sharply with their daily social standing. Yet paradoxically, their performances could earn them a certain respect and even fear, due to their perceived ability to interact with the spiritual realm through their laments. An interesting, and somewhat sad, fringe detail for many of these professional mourners, particularly in poorer communities, was their reliance on funeral food and drink as part of their payment or sustenance. They weren't just paid in coin. The meal provided at the wake or funeral was often a significant part of their remuneration, underscoring their often precarious economic position despite the vital cultural service they provided. Their status, then, was rarely one of unadulterated respect. It was always tinged with the shadows of death and the complexities of social class. The current of time pulls you forward, and you begin to witness the slow, inexorable decline and eventual disappearance of professional mourning as a widespread, accepted profession. The forces at play are multifaceted, a confluence of changing social norms, evolving religious beliefs, and the rise of more modern sensibilities regarding death and grief. You stand now in the early 20th century, a world rapidly shedding its Victorian elaborate rituals. The advent of the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent urbanization played a significant role. As populations moved from close-knit rural communities to sprawling, anonymous cities, the communal aspects of grief began to diminish. The traditional wake, where a whole village might participate in a long, drawn-out mourning period, gave way to more private, contained funeral services. There was less space, both literally and figuratively, for extended public displays of sorrow, and thus, less demand for those who specialized in orchestrating them. Moreover, changing religious attitudes contributed to the decline. Many mainstream Christian denominations, particularly Protestant faiths, continued to view the theatrical wailing of professional mourners as unseemly, insincere, or even pagan. They advocated for a more subdued, dignified, and personal expression of grief, emphasizing quiet prayer and acceptance of God's will. The emphasis shifted from demonstrating the intensity of grief to demonstrating faith and resignation. This theological shift slowly eroded the cultural acceptance of hired lamenters. One particular, yet influential detail was the rise of embalming and modern funeral homes. As funeral practices became more formalized and professionalized, the entire process moved indoors, away from the public eye. The body was prepared privately, viewed in a controlled setting, and then transported directly to the cemetery. There was simply no longer a space or a need for public processions led by wailing figures. The elaborate spectacles of ancient times, and even the solemn mutes of the Victorian era, seemed out of place in these more sanitized, efficient arrangements. You also notice a societal shift towards emotional restraint. The Victorian era, while elaborate in its mourning rituals, also prized stoicism. As the 20th century progressed, there was a growing discomfort with overt displays of emotion in public. Grief, while still deeply felt, became increasingly private. People were expected to grieve quietly, perhaps within the confines of their family, rather than through loud, public demonstrations. The very idea of paying someone to cry on your behalf began to seem emotionally dishonest, even a little absurd, to a population increasingly valuing authenticity. The professional mourner, once a necessary component of a grand ritual, became an anachronism, a holdover from a less enlightened time. Their services, once sought after, gradually faded into the realm of quaint, if slightly bizarre, historical footnotes. The tears that were once a professional duty now had to be genuinely shed. Yet, even as the overt practice of professional mourning receded into history, the underlying human need it once fulfilled never truly vanished. Your final stop is the present day, and you begin to see the subtle, sometimes unconscious ways in which the echoes of professional grief continue to resonate. The tears may no longer be for hire in the same way, but the desire for communal solace and ritualized farewells persists, merely morphing into new forms. Think about the modern funeral. While no longer featuring wailing women or silent mutes, there are still individuals whose roles, however understated, mirror aspects of the ancient mourners. Consider the funeral director, who, beyond logistics, often guides families through the etiquette of grief, helping them craft eulogies, choose appropriate music, and manage the emotional flow of the service. They act as facilitators of grief, ensuring a proper farewell, much like their historical predecessors. Then there are grief counselors, who, while not crying for you, provide a space for emotional expression and validation, helping individuals navigate their sorrow in a structured, often professional setting. This is a much more therapeutic approach, but it speaks to the enduring human need to process profound loss with guidance. You also see these echoes in the carefully curated social media tributes that follow a death. While personal, these digital memorials often involve a public performance of grief, shared photos, heartfelt messages, and expressions of sorrow that, in their collective outpouring, serve a similar function to the communal laments of old. It's a less direct form of hired grief, but a powerful collective expression nonetheless. A particularly interesting, though less common modern parallel, is the existence of funeral singers, or memorial musicians. While their primary role is to provide music, their carefully chosen songs and emotionally resonant performances are designed to evoke sorrow and remembrance, creating an atmosphere conducive to grieving. much like the melodic laments of the keeners. They don't explicitly cry, but their art aims to bring others to tears, fulfilling a similar emotional role. Even in our most private moments of grief, we often seek to externalize it, to give it form. We might dress in dark colors, observe periods of quiet reflection, or share stories of the deceased. These actions, however personal, are still part of a collective understanding of how to mourn. The professional mourner, in their various historical guises, always served a fundamental human need: to mark death, to honor the departed, and to provide a communal outlet for the overwhelming tide of sorrow. While the specific methods have changed, the universal language of loss and our desire to articulate it remains. The paid tear has become the freely shed tear, but the ritual of farewell endures, an unbreakable thread connecting us to all who have come before and all who will follow. Now, as the echoes of these long-lost laments fade, take a moment to simply breathe. Let the stories of ancient sorrows and forgotten cries gentle your own mind. The world of the living continues its quiet hum, far removed from the formal wails of the Preeficae or the haunting keens of Ireland. Feel the comfort of your space, the soft air around you, and let the historical shadows of grief recede. There is only the peaceful hush of the night. Sweet dreams.